Now that I've shown you some of the basic tools in Photoshop, let's go ahead and utilize some of those to make a montage of these two images. So I have my rooster image and I also have the beach image. And what I'd like to do is get rid of all of the background on my rooster and place my rooster on the beach. So that's what we're going to be working for right now. In order to do this, I'm going to use my zoom tool, and I'll just click a couple times to zoom in to the area that we're going to be working on, which is the rooster. You can conversely use your Command or Control plus to zoom in and Command or Control minus to zoom out. And I also tend to use the hand tool, which allows me to kind of move my document around and keep the same amount of zoom. If you have one of your other tools selected, you can quickly access the hand tool by holding down your space bar on your keyboard, and that gives you access to this hand tool where you can kind of slide your document around. So as I said, I want to remove the background portion of my rooster. Now we have a number of ways that we could approach this. We can go ahead and use some of our selection tools. So in the previous exercise, we used the marquee selection tools, which allow us to make rectangular and elliptical selections. I am now going to switch to the lasso-based tools. We have a freeform-based lasso tool, which allows you to just kind of make a selection in any sort of shape that you want. We have the polygon lasso tool, which allows you to make a more like a linear straight line selection. So probably wouldn't be that good for this particular shape, but if I click, you can see that I end up with this little straight line that I can use. And every time you click, it's like you're laying down another point. When I want to complete the shape, I would go back to the original portion of my shape. And you can see I get a little O in the lower right-hand corner. And if I click, it will now make the selection. So this is a great tool if you have a straight line element, but not so good for our rooster. And then we have something called the magnetic lasso tool. And the magnetic lasso tool allows you to just kind of run a little bit wild, and it will pick up and make a selection based on the values of the colors. So if you have a lot of high contrast in your image, this tends to work really well. But if you have an image where you don't have quite as much high contrast, you might not get that good of results. So this could be a good start, but you can see I definitely have some issues. I have to go in here and clean this up. So I'm just going to use my select deselect to deselect my selection. And we're going to move on to this next group of tools. This allows us to use the selection tools. So we have something called the object selection tool, which will allow you to draw a basic shape, like a rectangle in this case, so you can choose rectangle or a lasso. And once you have that basic shape, all you have to do is let go, and the application is going to interpolate what it thinks should be the selection. And again, like, it's not perfect around the beak, but for the most part, this does a pretty darn good job, and it's really quick. So these are great tools just to allow you to kind of get started, and then you might have to refine them. But before we come back to this, let's go ahead and explore these other ones. I have something called the quick selection tool, and I'm going to use my keyboard shortcut of Command or Control D to drop the selection. And the quick selection tool allows you to go ahead and use the paintbrush type of action and select the subject in that way. So I can kind of just draw around like this, and then when I let go, it's going to make that selection for me. Now, once you've drawn once, you'll notice that the option bar is going to switch you to the add to selection. So now I could continue to come down here and just kind of draw, and it'll continue to add to my selection. So as I draw around, I can increase the selection. And this works in some situations pretty well. You might need to increase the size of your brush. So if we can increase the size of our brush, and let's just deselect real quickly and try this again. Now you can see that this is working much better. So with the smaller size brush, didn't work so great. But now that I've increased the brush size, it does a pretty good job. I mean, it's obviously getting some things out here, and the feet are going to be a little tough on my rooster, but this again is a good start. So this one can work pretty well, but just remember the brush size, you might need to play around with this. So we have the size, which is the size of the brush. You can see the circle is going to represent the size of the brush. We have the hardness. So we have either a soft brush, which is a little bit more feathered or fuzzy on the edges. Your selection isn't going to be quite so crisp near the edges, or if you pump the hardness all the way up, it will be. And then you have spacing. So I generally will work with a pretty high hardness, and depending on my subject, I might have to adjust the brush size. If you do end up selecting stuff you don't want, you can use this subtract from selection icon. And if we reduce the brush size down a little bit and then come in here and kind of paint away, you can see how I might be able to eliminate some of that background that was back here by the tail feather. But again, depending on the color values of your subject and your background, you still might have to do some manual adjustment. And then finally we have the magic wand tool. This is more of a legacy tool. So again, I'm going to use Command or Control D to drop the selection. And the magic wand is just a series of you clicking. Now, when you click, you can see I didn't get very much of my rooster, and that's because I have a lot of varying colors in my rooster. So there's all sorts of different shades. This tool is based on picking up similar sorts of colors. So if I click in the tail feathers, this black portion was selected. When you use this tool, it's very common that you'll need to add to your selection. So if you hold down your Shift key, you can see I get a little plus sign in the lower left-hand corner, and that will allow me to add to the selection. You can also up the tolerance, which is going to increase the range of colors that it selects. So now when I click, I'm going to probably get more of the rooster. This works pretty good if you have areas that are similar in color value. When you have something that has a large diversity in colors, you might have to use something else in addition to this particular tool. So these are the basic selection tools. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to drop our selection using the keyboard shortcut. I will switch back to that object selection tool, and I'm going to switch from rectangle to lasso. And I'm just going to kind of draw a very rough estimate around my rooster. And the beauty of using these tools is, you don't have to be super perfect. Sometimes it's easier to use like a little piece and then hold down your Shift key and add to the selection, but we'll just kind of give it a go in one big selection, which makes it a little more difficult. Needless to say, I've done that, and as soon as I release my mouse, I have a fairly good selection. Now, if we zoom in and look around the edges, there is some areas that it didn't quite get, so we'll probably have to go in and touch those up. And again, there's a number of ways that you can approach this, but what I like to do in this particular situation is I like to switch to my quick mask mode. So you can easily do that by coming down here underneath your foreground and background colors and clicking this icon. And what happens is it's going to turn your document to be a bunch of area that is red. Red is the area that is not selected. The color that we see here is the area that is selected. And since I'm working on an object that has quite a bit of red in it, this might not be the best overlay color. So if you actually double click on this particular tool, it will open the quick mask options and you can change this color. So if we pick something like, bright green, now when I click OK and go into quick mask mode, you can see like my non-selected areas are green. And once you're in this mode, you can use any of your brush tools. So I'm going to get my brush tool right here. This is my paintbrush tool. And once again, if I go to the option bar, I can change the parameters on the brush. So I'm using a 20 pixel brush, which seems okay. I will keep my hardness pretty high at 100. And I'm just going to use a regular brush. I don't need any kind of special brush. And what I'll do is if I come to the document and I click right now, I'm painting with green, which means that I'm deselecting from my selection. So I'm going to do undo or Command or Control Z to keyboard shortcut undo, and we are going to flip our foreground and background color. So currently my foreground color was black. That means that I would be subtracting from my selection. If we flip this by using the little hooked arrow and switch this to white, now when I paint, you can see that I'm not painting with white, I'm just painting to the actual original image. So now what I'm doing is I'm in essence adding to my selection. So when you do this, this is a great way that you can refine a selection. And generally, you'll have to zoom in quite a bit, and you may have to adjust the size of the brush. Like here, when I'm working on the beak, you can see that I need a smaller brush to get the tip of the beak. So I could adjust it here, or my preference is to use the keyboard shortcuts of the bracket keys. The left bracket key reduces the size of the brush, and the right bracket key will increase the size of the brush. So that can be really helpful. And I'm super zoomed in right now, so I'm going to use my space bar to toggle to that hand tool that we talked about earlier. And again, this is a very small area, so I'm going to make my brush even smaller and just kind of paint in these little itty bitty feathers. And when you're making a selection like this, like, it takes a little bit of time. It's not instantaneous. I mean, if you do have a photograph of something against a high contrasting background, so if I took a picture of a person against a white background or something like that, it would be really easy to drop out the background. It gets a little bit more challenging when the background is a little bit more similar, which happens a lot of times, to the subject. So that is the case of our little chicken right here, our rooster. And so I'm just kind of using this paintbrush tool. I'm using my bracket keys to periodically increase and or decrease the size of the brush as necessary. And I'm just going to scooch around on the zoomed in portion of my image so that I can continue to add into my selection. And if you really want to do a proper job, you know, this probably is going to take a little bit of time for you to refine this. I have a couple of other tutorials on this. Here I need to subtract from the selection, so I'm just switching my foreground and background color, and I'm going to subtract, and then I'll toggle back. If you want a keyboard shortcut for doing that, the keyboard shortcut is X. So X will let you do that, and it looks like the chicken has like a little bit of kind of fluff right here, so I'm just going to kind of paint in this little fluffy fuzz of an area right here. And I won't worry too much about that. I'll come up here to these tail feathers and just kind of continue to do this. And I'm just going to do this until my selection is refined. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit and just kind of get through making the selection. And I probably won't do like a super bang up job right now just because it's a little boring to continue to watch this. So you guys can just hang tight for a few minutes and just know that, you know, I'm using those keyboard shortcuts and I'm just kind of doing some repetition on what I just explained to you. It is worth pointing out that sometimes when you're doing this sort of work, you may need to like temporarily turn the quick mask off just because sometimes you kind of can't always see exactly what you're doing. So you can just toggle it on and off and just take a quick peek just to make sure that, you know, what you are adding to or subtracting away is indeed what you want to do. Like I said before, this probably is going to take a little bit of time to really refine, but I'm just going to make it a little rough. And you can see my chicken legs did not get selected, and that's because they are pretty close to the background color values. So in order for me to add those, I really would probably have to come in here. I don't think any of my selection tools are going to give me much use. So we'll just kind of get a little bit of the chicken claw in here. I really find those keyboard shortcuts to be super handy when you're doing this kind of work. So you can kind of experiment around with those. They tend to give you a little bit more flexibility in your whole painting job and just allow you to do some things a little bit faster. Grabbing all this chicken feet is making me want to put on some lotion. This guy looks like he has some dry skin going. All right, let's turn this off and just check out the feet. They're, okay for this demonstration. I'm using my keyboard shortcut of Command or Control minus to zoom back out. And you can see my marching ants have now allowed me to make a more refined selection. And so now what I want to do is I want to get rid of the outer edge. So again, I could go up to select, inverse to select everything else, and just hit delete. And you can see all of that stuff goes away. So this is totally okay. You could do that. I'm going to do undo to get back. And what I actually prefer to do is, I'm going to set this back to my selection like it was before, is I like to do something called layer masks. So if we come to our layer panel and you come down to this icon right here, it'll add a layer mask. And the layer mask is going to take whatever is selected and leave it as being visible. And then whatever wasn't part of the selection goes away. The beauty of the mask is that this is non-destructive. And what I mean by that is, let's say I zoom in and maybe I decided I don't want this little fluff right here because I don't know, it doesn't work or whatever. So I can make sure that the mask portion of the layer is selected. Do you see how that has this little frame right here? And then if we use the brush tool, and again, if I paint with black, the non-selected parts of the image are appearing in black in the mask. And then if I paint with white, I would be adding to the selection. So you can really come in here and you can still have the opportunity to refine the selection by either subtracting or adding and bringing back some of that stuff. So this works really well. So, you can see how I got a little bit of the edges on these toenails and whatever. So I might want to subtract those. This is what we call non-destructive editing, in that we're not actually making any permanent changes. Like if I had just inversed and deleted, I would be making a permanent change. But because I'm doing this in the mask mode, I'm not. And another advantage of using the mask is that if you go to your property panel, you can actually increase the feather. And when I increase the feather, you can see that it kind of like blurs the edge. So it's diffusing the edge and making it more soft. And sometimes you just don't want that super hard edge. It's too hard. So you can just add a little bit of feather and it just kind of softens the edges a little bit. The density of the mask is another way that you can increase or decrease how your selection is working. And there's some other options that are a little bit more advanced for working with masks. We're just going to, again, work with the basics right now. So now, if I switch back to the move tool, the rooster and the mask are linked. So now I can move this around and it moves both the mask and the rooster. So maybe I just want this like giant rooster to be on the beach right here. Maybe he's, walking around. I don't know, whatever. But you can see that I can add these things. And then because we're working in Photoshop and we're working with layers, we might want to stick a layer in between these and create just a little bit of a shadow. So if I use my brush tool and I get a really kind of a large brush and I'm going to reduce the hardness down so it's kind of soft edged, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to reduce the opacity, and I don't want to be painting with teal but black, so I'm just going to click the black foreground and white background. And now let's increase our brush a little bit more. If I go ahead and I paint, I can kind of paint in this little shadow. So you can see that it's allowing me to kind of paint in this shadow, because obviously if there was an enormous chicken at the beach, it would certainly be casting a shadow. So I can kind of come in here, and because I'm using a lower opacity, as I add, my shadow gets a little denser, and I can kind of paint in a more realistic type of shadow that my rooster might be casting here. And if you find that you go a little wild with your shadow, you can always switch to your eraser tool, and with the eraser tool you can erase. So again, I'm going to make my eraser have a soft edged brush. We'll make this kind of big, and maybe we'll lower the opacity to like 50%. And then I can just kind of come in here and soften this shadow a little bit and erase some of it if I thought it was a little heavy-handed. We also, because this is its own layer, I'll name this, and we can reduce the opacity. So I can use this little slider and actually even bring this down a little bit and reduce the opacity. But in this way, we can take two completely separate images and combine them together. And this, it really is one of the coolest things you can do with Photoshop, right? Like you can take images and you can combine them. And I did this pretty quickly, but if you took a little bit more time and really refined your selection and worked a little bit more on your shadow, you could make something that might look a little bit more realistic. So these are just some things that you can do. I would say that this is a pretty common use of Photoshop. Touching up images, removing portions of an image, combining images together, and we could even add a little title here. So we might want to call this Beach Rooster. I'm going to use my text tool, and I can come here and just click, and I'll just say Beach Rooster, and I'm going to highlight my text. We'll make this a lot bigger. You can see that my text only goes up to 72. So if I want to make this like 300, I can type in 300 and it'll go ahead and apply that. And right now I'm just using this beauty font, but obviously I have a bunch of different fonts that I can choose from. So I could choose whatever I wanted to. Maybe I want a little space in here. I can make a space, and now I have a little title for my document right here. And if you want to make any modifications, you would go back to the text tool, highlight the text, and if we want to change the color, we could open up our color picker. If I come to the image, I could sample right from the image, maybe get a little red from the comb on my rooster and see what that looks like. So, I kind of like that, and really just you have endless possibilities. So this is really just to give you a little taste of some of the things that you can do with Photoshop and how to use some of the tools. I would totally encourage you just to start playing around with it, combining images, making images, and trying to refine them in a way that is appealing to you.